efficiency has resulted in an ever-growing net gain of production over consumption. Otherwise, we would never realize an accumulation of physical wealth and would always be engaged in a bare hand-to-mouth existence. Consequently, the true cost of production is in fact falling, and the consumer should reap a commensurate benefit through increased purchasing power and falling prices, backed, of course, by this real wealth. It is at this point that the social credit makes a resolute and decisive departure from orthodoxy. Money is essentially a bookkeeping system. If, as we have seen, new wealth is created without the introduction of new credits to properly reflect its existence, then it is obvious that such new credits must be provided by some appropriate means. And if costs are being created more rapidly than incomes, then credits must be provided that will cancel these excess costs without creating new financial costs in the process. That is, we must depart from convention and introduce a supplementary flow of credit into the economy which is not issued for production, but which is issued instead directly for consumption. Such consumption credits will not create more costs because they don't go through the productive system, but will flow down to cancel the excess of costs flowing from the price system, making the latter self-liquidating. In other words, balancing the price system. Hence, Douglas proposed the consumer dividend to augment the purchasing power of each citizen and the compensated price discount to retailers to lower the price level. Thus, each person would receive the benefits of increasing technological efficiency, in effect, as his rightful inheritance of a share in the expanding communal capital. It's interesting to note, just aside here, Karl Marx wanted to put the communal capital in the hands of the state, which really means in the hands of that clique that operates the state. Major Douglas, in a sense, wanted to distribute the communal capital to each individual. There are two completely different policies. We have seen then that the two major objectives of orthodox economists must derive from a policy very different from social credit. We shall also see that this policy derives from a very different philosophy. Because of its insistence that money must be issued only as a debt for production, and because of its insistence that all financial costs must be recovered through prices, orthodoxy has never in fact managed to create stable prices. Indeed, it has been responsible for the continuing and progressive inflation that has characterized the world economy over its entire history under orthodox financial direction. However, even stable prices are not acceptable to social creditors. Many social creditors, I hear, say we'd like to have stable prices. Stable prices are not acceptable. Social creditors, because they demand falling prices with advancing technological efficiency in order to satisfy Douglas's law of cost, the two costs of production and consumption. Moreover, the necessity to issue credits directly for consumption invalidates the orthodox desideratum of full employment. Full employment is an inseparable requirement of the policy of issuing credit only for production. As we've already demonstrated, this policy is the core cause of the power age phenomenon of intensifying cost-push inflation, which Douglas discovered as early as 1917 and 1918, and which orthodox economists only began to suspect without understanding during the 1950s. Social credit, with its policy of credits for consumption, necessarily heralds a new era, an age of leisure. It's not a question of whether or not we can afford an age of leisure. It is rather a question of how long we can survive as a civilization without it. The claim can be made categorically that the policy of full employment with its corollary, that is, a deficiency of purchasing power in each trade area, is directly and indirectly responsible for the following major economic and social afflictions. Because our overriding concern has turned to creating work instead of providing goods and services for consumption, as, when, and where required, in Douglas's words, in the most efficient manner possible, tremendous waste, misdirection of resources, and inefficiency have come to characterize our economy. the actual and potential benefits of modern science are sabotaged on a gigantic scale. Douglas referred to this as the tragedy of human effort, as the diminution of the purchasing power of effort. Now, because each cycle of production results in a larger carryover of unliquidated costs, we must always produce more before we are able to claim the wealth that has been produced in previous cycles, or in the current cycle, to be exact. The economy has become a treadmill from which there can be no escape. Driven by a constant necessity, because of growing disparity between costs and incomes, to generate additional purchasing power for its very survival, the economy is forced into a mindless upward spiral of expansion. Because incomes are never sufficient, governments inject larger and larger amounts of money in order to prime the economy. Becomes national debt. Both private and public debts, with their tributes of interest, pyramid. Inflation robs the individual of his savings, denying him economic security, and throwing him more and more on the mercy of the state or other sources of centralized power. Eventually, the state must become supreme as it takes over, all in the name of humanitarianism, of course, a growing number of functions that individuals could and would otherwise do for themselves. Individual freedom of choice and action decline, and with them spontaneity, creativity, initiative, and efficiency. I once worked in a plant, and an engineer came up to the area where I was, and he seemed very unhappy, and I said, "What's the problem today?" And he said, "Well, it's the process in the basement." I said, "Well, what's wrong?" And he said, "Well," he said, "it's nobody's fault, but he said, it's the process." He said, "It's unstable, and it's just not working at all." I said, "Well, what is wrong?" He said, "Well, it's the human element. They just simply cannot, as human beings, operate to those fine specifications." And I said, "Well, for goodness sakes, couldn't you automate it or use your technology to iron the problem out?" And he looked at me right straight in the eye, amazed, and said, "Well, yes," he said, "but my God," he said, "we can't do that." He said, "We put all those men out of a job." That's the type of reasoning that we operate on. Not that I'm criticizing him specifically, but it is the type of reasoning that we do operate on. The situation becomes worse as savage taxes are imposed, professedly or ostensibly, to control the accelerating inflation and to correct the many injustices that spring from it through income redistribution. Now, the consumer loses control over his income, and he is more and more deprived of his economic vote, his money vote. He can no longer dictate production policy through freely chosen expenditure of his own income. Both economic and political democracy decline as production policy falls under increasingly centralized control. Now, production patterns become distorted as more and more wasteful projects are undertaken in an unrealistic and futile attempt to maintain the distribution of financial incomes through full employment. Colossal waste of natural resources has ensued. Some of those resources, as we learn today, may well be irreplaceable. The fertility of the land suffers, as those who till it are compelled to abandon sound practices of husbandry. Caught in a desperate struggle to cope with rising costs of operation, those engaged in agriculture are forced to mine the land by extracting as much as possible from it, with minimal return in the way of proper care and cultivation. As we know today, that is not serving to solve their problem. They are in fact being put out of business right and left. That is the farm. The economic system gradually shifts away from production for genuine consumer satisfaction toward excessive capital production as a means to close the widening chasm between costs and incomes. Eventually, the state can only resort to building great pyramids in the name of full employment and eventually for its own edification. This perversion of means into ends, this denial in practice that the true end of production is consumption, was recognized as early as the late 19th century by the English author John Ruskin. Ruskin's statement on the matter, in his Unto This Last, can hardly be improved upon. Capital, he says, is a root which does not enter into vital function till it produces something else than a root, namely fruit. That fruit will in time again produce roots, and so all living capital issues in reproduction of capital. But capital, which produces nothing but capital, is only root producing root, bulb issuing in bulb, never in tulip, seed issuing in seed, never in grape. The political economy of Europe, Ruskin said, has hitherto devoted itself wholly to the multiplication or the aggregation of bulbs. It never saw nor conceived such a thing as a tulip. End of quote. Stress is laid more and more on promoting exports as we attempt to capture external, so-called external purchasing power